Her worn work boots hit the asphalt as she stepped into the parking lot of Falcon Point Naval Air Station. No uniform, no badge, no insignia, just a simple navy blue polo shirt with parking services embroidered on the chest, and a quiet confidence that nobody noticed. The Navy pilots walking past barely glanced her way, dismissing her as just another civilian employee. By lunch break, someone had accidentally spilled coffee on her clipboard. By afternoon, they were filming her for laughs, mocking the meter maid who dared to work on their prestigious base. But then, an F-18 Super Hornet experienced catastrophic engine failure at 15,000 feet, and everything changed. Hours later, a Navy helicopter touched down on the tarmac and outstepped Admiral Janet Blackwood, the highest-ranking officer on the East Coast. She walked straight to the woman they'd been mocking, snapped a crisp salute, and said 9 words that made the entire air station fall silent. "Chief Warrant Officer Novak, we need you back in service." So who was she, and why did her past make seasoned Navy pilots question everything they thought they knew about respect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 32, Grace Novak didn't look like someone who had once talked pilots through life-or-death emergencies from aircraft carrier control towers. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, secured with a basic black elastic band. Her work boots were scuffed from months of walking across hot asphalt, directing traffic and managing parking spaces. The polo shirt she wore was standard issue for civilian contractors. Nothing special, nothing that commanded attention. She carried a basic clipboard, a handheld radio, and a water bottle that had seen better days. That Tuesday morning in Jacksonville, Florida, Grace arrived at Falcon Point Naval Air Station just like she had every day for the past 8 months. The security guard at the main gate, Officer Jim Reeves, waved her through with barely a glance. "Morning, Grace," he called out, already turning his attention to the next vehicle. She nodded back, steering her 10-year-old Honda Civic toward the employee parking area behind the main administrative building. Falcon Point wasn't just any naval installation. It was one of the premier flight training facilities on the East Coast, where the Navy's brightest pilots came to master advanced combat maneuvers and emergency procedures. The base sprawled across 2,400 acres of prime Florida real estate, with 4 active runways capable of handling everything from small training aircraft to massive cargo planes. Sleek F-18 Super Hornets lined the tarmac like metallic predators, their surfaces gleaming under the morning sun. The control tower rose 120 feet into the sky, its windows reflecting the constant dance of aircraft taking off and landing. This was where future Top Gun pilots earned their wings, where million-dollar aircraft pushed the boundaries of physics daily, where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The pilots who trained here carried themselves with the swagger that came from knowing that they were among the elite, the top 1% of naval aviators. Grace understood this world better than anyone realized. As she parked her car and gathered her equipment, her eyes automatically tracked the flight patterns overhead. A T-45 Goshawk was approaching from the northeast, coming in slightly high for its approach angle. The pilot corrected smoothly, dropping altitude and adjusting trim. Good recovery, she thought to herself. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive whine of F-18 engines spinning up for launch. The parking services office was a small, prefabricated building tucked between the base exchange and the visitor center. She checked in with her supervisor, a retired Navy petty officer named Carl Henderson, who ran the civilian contractor operations. "Got a busy day ahead," Carl told her, pointing to a schedule board covered in colored sticky notes. "VIP inspection this afternoon, plus we've got that big training exercise starting at 1,400 hours. Gonna need you managing the overflow lot in your Hangar 7. Grace nodded, studying the layout. Hangar 7 was where they kept the advanced trainer aircraft, the expensive machines that rookie pilots used to transition from basic flight school to combat-ready status. It was also right next to the main pilot briefing facility, which meant she'd be working directly adjacent to some of the most arrogant aviators on the base. She'd learned to keep her head down and do her job quietly.
8 months ago, when she'd first applied for this position, the interviewer had asked why someone with her background wanted to work in parking services. Grace had given a simple answer: I need steady work and I like being around aircraft. It was true, just not the whole truth. What she didn't mention was that being near the planes without the pressure of life or death decisions felt like therapy. She could hear the engines, smell the jet fuel, watch the controlled chaos of flight operations, all without the crushing weight of responsibility she'd once carried.
As Grace loaded her equipment into the small electric cart she used to patrol the parking areas, she caught sight of a group of pilots walking toward the briefing rooms. They moved with that characteristic aviator swagger, flight suits perfectly pressed, sunglasses perched just right, voices carrying the casual confidence of people who regularly defied gravity for a living. She recognized a few faces from her daily rounds. Lieutenant Derek Vaughn led the group, his tall frame and perfectly styled blonde hair making him impossible to miss. His wingwoman, Lieutenant Amber Costello, walked beside her, her dark hair braided in regulation style, her posture radiating the kind of precision that came from years of military discipline. Grace had overheard enough conversations to know that these weren't just any pilots. Vaughn was being fast-tracked for command positions, the son of a retired admiral who'd graduated at the top of his class from the Naval Academy. Costello had earned her wings in record time and was rumored to be in line for test pilot school. They were the golden children of naval aviation, young, talented, and absolutely convinced of their own superiority. As Grace drove her cart toward the overflow parking area, she passed close enough to the group to hear fragments of their conversation. New combat maneuvering instructor starts today. Heard he flew combat missions over Syria. Gonna be intense training. She kept her expression neutral, her eyes focused on the road ahead. In her previous life, she would have been part of conversations like that. She would have been the one briefing pilots on emergency procedures, the voice in their headsets talking them through crisis situations, the person they trusted to guide them home when everything went wrong. But that was before. Before the accident. Before the investigation. Before she'd decided that some responsibilities were too heavy to carry. The overflow parking lot near Hangar 7 was already starting to fill up. Grace began directing incoming vehicles, using hand signals to guide drivers to available spaces. It was simple work. Point left, point right, hold up a hand to stop, wave them forward when the path was clear. No split-second decisions that could cost lives. No voices crackling through radio static, desperate for guidance. Just cars and painted lines and the Florida sun beating down on asphalt. But even as she went through the motions of her civilian job, Grace's trained eyes continued to monitor the flight operations around her. She noted wind direction, watched approach angles, listened to the subtle changes in engine sounds that could indicate mechanical issues. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits had once meant the difference between life and death for hundreds of pilots under her command. The morning passed quietly. Grace directed traffic, updated parking logs, and responded to minor issues. A visitor who couldn't find the right building, a contractor who'd parked in the wrong zone. Routine, predictable, safe. Exactly what she'd been looking for when she'd taken this job. She had no way of knowing that by the end of the day, her carefully constructed new life would be shattered, and the skills she'd tried so hard to leave behind would once again determine whether young pilots lived or died. The trouble started at 0930 hours, just as the morning flight training sessions were transitioning to advanced maneuvers. Grace was directing traffic near the main pilot briefing facility when Lieutenant Derek Vaughn and his squadron emerged from their pre-flight meeting. They moved as a tight group, flight bags slung over shoulders, helmets tucked under arms, their conversation animated with the kind of energy that came before challenging training exercises. Vaughn spotted Grace first. He paused mid-sentence, his ice blue eyes taking in her civilian contractor uniform, her weathered clipboard, the small electric cart parked nearby with its flashing amber light. A slow smirk spread across his face, the kind of expression that suggested he'd just noticed something amusing and slightly beneath his attention. "Well, well," Vaughn said, his voice carrying just loud enough for his squadron mates to hear. "Looks like they've got the meter maids working overtime today." He gestured toward Grace with a casual wave of his flight gloves. "Hope you've got enough tickets in that little book of yours, ma'am. We fighter pilots are notorious for parking violations." Lieutenant Amber Costello looked up from her flight notes, following Vaughn's gaze to where Grace stood. Her dark eyes assessed the situation quickly. A civilian contractor, obviously low-ranking, working a menial job on their prestigious base. She let out a small laugh, the sound sharp and dismissive. "I didn't know they hired traffic cops to work on a naval air station. What's next? Mall security?" The comment drew chuckles from the other pilots in the group. Ensign Kevin Mills, fresh out of flight school and eager to fit in with the experienced aviators, stepped closer to get a better look. "Maybe she's here to make sure we don't exceed the speed limit on the taxiways," he said, his voice carrying the forced humor of someone trying too hard to impress his superiors. Grace kept her expression neutral, her hands steady on her clipboard. She'd encountered military arrogance before. In her previous life, she'd dealt with cocky pilots who thought their wings made them invincible. The difference was that back then, she wore the uniform and carried the rank to command their respect. Now, she was just another civilian contractor, invisible except when she became a target for their amusement. "Excuse me, miss," Vaughn called out, his tone dripping with false politeness. He took several steps toward Grace, his flight suit immaculate, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who'd never been told he wasn't welcome anywhere. "You seem a little out of place here. This is a restricted area for flight operations. Are you sure you're supposed to be directing traffic this close to the flight line?" Grace looked up from her clipboard, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm assigned to overflow parking management for today's VIP inspection and training exercise," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, professional, giving nothing away. Costello exchanged a look with Vaughn, one eyebrow raised in amusement. "Your supervisor?" she repeated, as if the words themselves were funny. "And who exactly is your supervisor? Someone in parking enforcement?" The way she said it made the job sound like the lowest possible position on the military hierarchy. "Carl Henderson, civilian contractor operations," Grace replied, her tone remaining even. She didn't explain that Henderson was a 20-year Navy veteran who'd served on 3 aircraft carriers. She didn't mention that she'd specifically requested this assignment because it kept her close to flight operations without being directly involved. She simply stated the facts and waited. Vaughn circled Flightly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Carl Henderson," he mused aloud. "Never heard of him. But then again, we don't usually interact with the support staff." He emphasized the last 2 words, making it clear exactly where he thought Grace fit in the base hierarchy. More pilots had gathered now, drawn by the spectacle. Word spread quickly through military communities, and entertainment was rare during the long hours between training flights. They formed a loose semicircle around Grace, some leaning against nearby vehicles, others standing with arms crossed, all watching to see how this would play out. "Excuse me, miss," Costello called out, stepping closer to examine Grace's clipboard. "What exactly qualifies someone to direct parking at a naval air station? Did you have to pass some kind of parallel parking test?" The question drew laughter from the assembled pilots, and Costello smiled at her own wit. Ensign Mills, emboldened by the group dynamic, pulled out his phone. "This is actually kind of funny," he said, holding up the device. "Mind if I get a quick video? My friends back home won't believe there's actually someone whose job is to tell Navy pilots where to park their cars." Grace's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but she didn't protest. She'd been recorded before, during congressional hearings and military tribunals, when every word and gesture was analyzed for signs of weakness or incompetence. A phone video by some rookie pilot was nothing compared to that scrutiny. "Make sure you get the uniform in the shot," Costello suggested helpfully. "The polo shirt really captures the professional atmosphere she brings to our world-class training facility." The mockery was building momentum now, feeding on itself like a fire giving fresh oxygen. Grace could see it in their body language, the way they leaned in closer, the increasing boldness of their comments, the assumption that because she wasn't fighting back, she was fair game for whatever entertainment they could extract from the situation. But Grace wasn't fighting back for reasons they couldn't begin to understand. She'd learned the hard way that sometimes the strongest response was no response at all. Sometimes survival meant letting others underestimate you, letting them believe they had all the power, letting them think they knew exactly who you were and what you were capable of. What none of them realized was that Grace had been underestimated before, by enemy pilots who thought an American aircraft carrier was an easy target, by hostile forces who believed they could overwhelm her defensive strategies, by politicians who assumed a young female officer couldn't handle the pressure of life-or-death decisions. They'd all been wrong then, and they were about to be wrong again. By 1100 hours, word had spread through the pilot ready rooms like wildfire. The story grew with each telling. There was a civilian parking attendant who thought she belonged near the flight line, someone so clueless about military protocol that she actually tried to argue with real Navy pilots. The tale became more elaborate with each retelling, transforming Grace from a quiet contractor doing her job into a symbol of everything the pilots believed was wrong with civilian oversight of military operations. Lieutenant Derek Vaughn had returned from his morning training flight in an excellent mood. His squadron had executed a perfect formation bombing run, his landing had been textbook smooth, and now he had an audience eager to hear about the morning's entertainment. In the pilot lounge, a sterile room filled with worn leather chairs and aviation magazines, he held court like a conquering hero. "You should have seen her face," Vaughn said, gesturing with his coffee cup for emphasis. Standing there with her little clipboard, trying to look official, I asked her about her qualifications, and she starts talking about certifications like she's some kind of expert. He shook his head in mock disbelief. "Certifications for directing parking. Can you imagine?" Lieutenant Amber Costello, fresh from her own successful training mission, perched on the arm of a nearby chair. "The best part was when Mills started filming," she added. "She just stood there and took it, didn't even try to defend herself. I almost felt sorry for her." The word almost carried enough emphasis to make it clear that any sympathy had been purely theoretical. The lounge was filling up with pilots between flights, and each new arrival was quickly brought up to speed on the morning's events. The story evolved slightly with each telling, but the core message remained the same. They'd encountered a civilian who didn't know her place, and they'd put her in it. Ensign Kevin Mills pulled out his phone, scrolling to the video he'd recorded. "I got most of it on camera," he announced. "This is going straight to social media. My Instagram followers are going to love this." He started typing caption suggestions, reading them out loud for approval. "Navy pilots meet parking enforcement, elite aviators versus meter maid, the clash between real military and civilian contractors." Commander Paul Hendricks entered the lounge during this impromptu social media strategy session. At 45, Hendricks was old enough to remember when military discipline meant something more than social media posts, but young enough to understand the importance of morale among his pilots. He'd heard fragments of the story from other instructors, and while part of him disapproved of picking on civilian contractors, another part appreciated anything that built unit cohesion. "What's all the excitement about?" Hendricks asked, accepting a cup of coffee from the communal pot that had been brewing since 0500 hours. Vaughn straightened slightly, recognizing the need to present the situation in terms a senior officer would appreciate. "Sir, we encountered a situation this morning with a civilian contractor who seemed confused about access protocols near the flight line. We took the opportunity to educate her about the importance of maintaining proper boundaries between civilian support staff and flight operations personnel."
Costello nodded earnestly. It's really a safety issue, Commander. If civilian contractors start thinking they can work anywhere on the base without proper oversight, it could compromise operational security. Hendricks considered this, swirling his coffee thoughtfully. The explanation sounded reasonable, even responsible. And how did this educational opportunity unfold? We simply pointed out that she needed to understand her role and stay within appropriate boundaries. Very professional, very by the book. Nothing that would reflect poorly on the squadron. Mills, still focused on his phone, looked up suddenly. Should I not post this video then? I mean, if it's a security issue. Post it, Costello said quickly, but maybe edit out anything that shows specific aircraft or base layouts. We don't want to give away operational details. Hendricks nodded approvingly. Good thinking. Social media presence is important for recruiting and public relations, but operational security always comes first. He paused, considering. Just make sure the tone stays professional. We want to represent naval aviation positively. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace appeared outside the lounge windows, visible through the glass as she directed traffic in the nearby parking area. Her movements were efficient and practiced, her attention focused on the steady stream of vehicles arriving for the afternoon's VIP inspection. There she is, Vaughn said, pointing through the window. Still at it. You have to admire the dedication to whatever it is she thinks she's doing. The comment drew chuckles from around the room, and several pilots moved to the windows for a better view. They watched Grace work, making quiet comments about her technique, her appearance, her obvious lack of understanding about the importance of the work happening around her. Someone should go check on her, suggested Lieutenant Ryan Torres, a pilot known for his practical jokes. Make sure she's not getting overwhelmed by all that responsibility.
I'll go, volunteered Mills, already pocketing his phone. Maybe I can get some more footage for the follow-up post. But before anyone could move, the base public address system crackled to life. Attention all personnel. VIP inspection commencing at 1300 hours. All non-essential civilian contractors report to designated holding areas. Flight operations will continue as scheduled. The announcement served as a reminder that they had more important things to focus on than a single parking attendant. The afternoon would bring a visit from high-ranking Navy officials, including representatives from the Pentagon who were evaluating the base's training programs. Every pilot knew that their performance during the VIP visit could impact their career prospects. All right, people, Hendricks said, setting down his coffee cup. Fun's over. We've got real work to do. I want everyone focused on making this base look like the premier training facility it is. No distractions, no drama, just professional excellence. The pilots began to disperse, gathering their gear and preparing for the afternoon's activities. But the mood had been set, the dynamic established. Grace had been categorized as entertainment, a convenient target for stress relief between serious military business. She wasn't a person with her own story and background. She was just a civilian contractor who'd provided a few minutes of amusement during an otherwise routine day. As Vaughn headed toward the door, he glanced back through the window one more time. Grace was still there, still working, still maintaining that same calm professionalism that had so annoyed him during their morning encounter. Something about her composure bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "See you later, parking lady," he muttered under his breath, then pushed through the door and strode toward his aircraft, already focused on the afternoon's training mission. None of them noticed that Grace had positioned herself with a clear view of the flight line, her eyes tracking aircraft movements with the kind of precision that came from years of experience. None of them saw the way she unconsciously monitored radio chatter from nearby ground crew, or how her head tilted slightly whenever she heard certain aviation terms that most civilians wouldn't recognize. They saw what they expected to see, a civilian contractor doing civilian work. What they missed was the former chief warrant officer who had once coordinated air traffic control for an entire carrier battle group, whose voice had been the last thing dozens of pilots heard before successful emergency landings, whose split-second decisions had saved more lives than any of them would ever know. But they would learn, sooner than any of them imagined. At 12:45 hours, just 15 minutes before the scheduled VIP inspection, Grace was methodically checking vehicle registrations in the overflow parking area when she heard the sharp whistle of someone demanding attention. She looked up to see Commander Paul Hendricks striding toward her position, his flight suit crisp despite the floorness humidity, his expression carrying the kind of authority that came from years of commanding respect in high-pressure situations. Behind Hendricks walked Master Chief Petty Officer Ray Hutchins, a weathered veteran whose 28 years of service had taken him from enlisted maintenance to senior leadership. Hutchins carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen everything the Navy could throw at him and had survived to tell the tales. His presence alongside Hendricks sent a clear message. This wasn't a casual conversation. Grace straightened slightly but continued her work, noting the registration numbers on her clipboard with the same methodical precision she'd maintained all morning. She'd dealt with senior officers before, and she knew that showing deference didn't always mean stopping what you were doing. Sometimes it meant demonstrating that you could maintain professional standards even under scrutiny. "Ma'am," Hendricks called out when he was still 10 feet away, his voice carrying the kind of projection that could cut through jet engine noise. "I need to speak with you about your current assignment." Grace set down her pen and turned to face him fully, her posture respectful but not subservient. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Hendricks stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. It was a classic power positioning technique, one designed to emphasize the difference in their status and authority. "I've received reports that you've been operating in restricted areas without proper authorization. Specifically, that you've been directing traffic in zones designated for flight operations personnel only." "Sir, I was assigned to overflow parking management by my supervisor, Carl Henderson. The assignment was cleared through base operations according to standard protocol for VIP inspection support." Master Chief Hutchins stepped forward, consulting a tablet computer. "I don't see any Carl Henderson on today's authorization list, and I certainly don't see any civilian contractors approved for operations near the flight line." Grace felt a familiar sinking sensation, the same feeling she'd experienced during the final months of her Navy career when bureaucratic procedures had become more important than practical results. "Master Chief, Mr. Henderson submitted the paperwork through civilian contractor operations. It should be in the system under facilities management." Hendricks exchanged a look with Hutchins, and Grace could see the decision forming in their expressions. They'd already concluded that she was either lying or incompetent, and any explanation she offered would only confirm their assessment. "Here's what I think happened," Hendricks said, his tone taking on the patient quality of someone explaining simple concepts to a confused child. "Someone gave you a general assignment to help with parking during today's inspection. You misunderstood the scope of that assignment and decided to expand your authority into areas where you don't belong." "That's not," Grace began, but Hutchins raised a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we don't have time for lengthy discussions about paperwork. We have Pentagon officials arriving in 10 minutes, and they're going to expect to see a base operating at peak efficiency. That means everyone needs to be exactly where they're supposed to be, doing exactly what they're authorized to do." Grace nodded slowly, recognizing the futility of arguing with senior officers who had already made up their minds. In her previous life, she would have been the one making these kinds of decisions, prioritizing operational readiness over individual concerns. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I understand," she said quietly. "Where would you like me to relocate?" Hendricks pointed toward a distant parking area near the base exchange, at least half a mile from any flight operations. "Over there. General parking management only. No contact with military personnel, no interaction with official visitors, no involvement in anything related to flight operations. And ma'am," Hutchins added, his voice carrying a warning tone, "I want to be very clear about something. Military installations operate on discipline and respect for authority. When senior officers give you direction, we expect immediate compliance. No questions, no explanations, no attempts to justify actions that exceed your authority." Grace felt the weight of their combined authority pressing down on her, the same institutional pressure that had ultimately driven her from the Navy.
She'd fought it once before and lost everything that mattered to her. This time, she simply nodded. Understood, Master Chief. I'll relocate immediately. Good, Hendricks said, already turning away. And let's make sure this kind of confusion doesn't happen again. Clear communication prevents problems.
As the two senior officers walked away, Grace began gathering her equipment with mechanical precision. She'd been officially marginalized, pushed to the furthest corner of the base where she could do her civilian work without bothering the important military personnel. It was a familiar feeling, one that brought back memories of congressional hearings where her expertise had been dismissed as irrelevant, where her years of successful operations had been overshadowed by a single tragic outcome. From across the parking area, she could see Lieutenant Vaughn and his squadron preparing for the VIP demonstration flight. They'd witnessed the entire exchange with Hendricks and Hutchins, and their satisfied expressions made it clear they viewed this as vindication of their morning's entertainment. Grace had been put in her place by proper authority, confirming everything they'd believed about civilian contractors who didn't understand their role in the military hierarchy. Vaughn caught her eye as she loaded her equipment into the electric cart and gave her a mocking salute, the gesture dripping with false respect. His squadron laughed appreciatively, treating the moment as the perfect conclusion to their morning's fun. Grace didn't respond to the provocation. She simply drove her cart toward the distant parking area, maintaining the same calm professionalism that had carried her through congressional interrogations and media scrutiny. She'd learned that dignity was something you carried within yourself, not something others could grant or take away. But as she positioned herself in the designated civilian area, far from the flight line and the important work of naval aviation, Grace couldn't help but notice the wind patterns shifting. The afternoon weather briefing had mentioned possible thunderstorm activity, and she could see the telltale signs of atmospheric instability building on the horizon. In her previous life, she would have been monitoring weather conditions, coordinating with meteorology, ensuring that flight operations had real-time updates on changing atmospheric conditions. Now, she was just a parking attendant, whose observations were considered irrelevant by the people making the important decisions. She settled into her new position and tried to focus on the simple work of directing civilian traffic. But her trained eyes continued to track the aircraft overhead, and her experienced mind continued to process the subtle signs that suggested the afternoon's flight demonstrations might encounter conditions that the current weather briefing hadn't anticipated. Time would tell whether that mattered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The VIP inspection proceeded flawlessly, at least from the perspective of those watching the carefully choreographed demonstration. Pentagon officials toured the facilities, observed flight operations, and nodded approvingly at the precision displayed by Falcon Point's elite pilots. What they didn't see was the systematic humiliation taking place in the background, orchestrated by pilots who had convinced themselves they were teaching an important lesson about military hierarchy. Grace had been relegated to the farthest corner of the base, managing general parking for civilian visitors and base personnel who weren't important enough to warrant closer access to the flight line. It should have been peaceful work, far from the tensions and politics of military aviation. Instead, it became the setting for an escalating campaign of petty harassment that grew bolder as the afternoon wore on. The first incident occurred at 14:30 hours, just as Grace was directing a staff car carrying visiting family members to an appropriate parking space. Lieutenant Derek Vaughn's F/18 Super Hornet roared overhead, completing a low-altitude demonstration pass that was technically within regulations, but executed with unnecessary aggression. The jet wash from his engines sent a cloud of dust and debris swirling through the parking area, coating Grace's clipboard with grit and forcing the civilian visitors to shield their faces from the sudden sandstorm. Grace looked up at the retreating aircraft, noting the tail number and the unnecessarily steep angle of the climb-out. In her previous life, she would have been coordinating those demonstration flights, ensuring they maintained proper safety margins and consideration for ground personnel. Now she was just another victim of a pilot's show-off maneuver.
15 minutes later, Ensign Kevin Mills drove past in a base vehicle, slowing down as he approached Grace's position. His passenger window was down, and he held his phone at the ready, clearly recording another video for his social media collection. "Hey, parking lady," Mills called out, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of someone performing for an audience. "How's business? Making sure all those minivans stay in their designated spots?" Grace didn't respond, but Mills continued his commentary for the benefit of his phone camera. "This is what civilian oversight looks like, folks. Professional parking enforcement at America's premier naval aviation facility. Your tax dollars at work." The video would be posted within the hour, complete with hashtags like #NavyLife, #civilian contractors, #parking enforcement, generating dozens of likes and comments from other military personnel who found humor in the obvious hierarchy gap between elite pilots and support staff. But the social media mockery was just the beginning. Lieutenant Amber Costello, fresh from her own successful demonstration flight, organized what she called an impromptu inspection of Grace's work area. She arrived with 3 other pilots, all carrying clipboards and wearing expressions of exaggerated seriousness. "Ma'am, we're conducting a quality assurance review of civilian contractor performance, standard procedure for VIP inspection days." The statement was complete fiction. No such review process existed, but Grace recognized it as harassment designed to look official to any observers. She stood quietly while the pilots walked around her assigned area, making notes on their clipboards and engaging in theatrical discussions about parking optimization and traffic flow efficiency. "I'm seeing some concerning gaps in coverage," announced Lieutenant Ryan Torres, pointing to an empty section of the parking lot with mock concern. "How do we ensure vehicles don't exceed posted speed limits in unsupervised areas?" "Good question," Costello replied, scribbling notes. "Ma'am, what's your response protocol for parking violations? Do you have citation authority, or do you need to escalate to actual security personnel?" Grace met her gaze steadily. "I report any violations to base security according to established procedures." "Established procedures," Torres repeated, as if the phrase was particularly amusing. "And what training did you receive on these procedures? Was there a formal certification process?" The questions continued for nearly 20 minutes, each one designed to emphasize Grace's civilian status and limited authority. The pilots treated it like a game, competing to see who could ask the most condescending question while maintaining a veneer of official business. Meanwhile, other squadron members were spreading embellished versions of the morning's encounter throughout the base. The story had evolved from a simple case of mistaken authority into a tale of civilian incompetence narrowly averted by vigilant military personnel. Grace had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing unqualified contractors too much autonomy on military installations.
In the pilot ready room, her photo was circulating on private group chats, accompanied by increasingly creative captions and memes. Someone had photoshopped her image onto various inappropriate backgrounds, directing traffic at a kindergarten, managing parking at a shopping mall, working as a crossing guard at an elementary school. The message was clear: she belonged anywhere except on a naval air station. Commander Hendricks, when shown some of the more creative social media posts, chose to interpret them as harmless morale-building activities rather than organized harassment. "Pilots need to blow off steam," he told Master Chief Hutchins. "As long as they're not interfering with operations or violating fraternization policies, a little humor is good for unit cohesion." What Hendricks didn't see were the more private moments. The way Ensign Mills accidentally spilled his energy drink near Grace's equipment, requiring her to spend precious time cleaning sticky residue from her radio and clipboard. He didn't witness Lieutenant Torres driving unnecessarily close to Grace's position, kicking up clouds of dust and forcing her to step aside repeatedly. He missed the coordinated effort to make her work as difficult and uncomfortable as possible while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions.
Grace endured it all with the same quiet professionalism that had carried her through congressional hearings and media interrogations. She cleaned her equipment without complaint, stepped aside for aggressive drivers without protest, and answered condescending questions without losing her composure. To outside observers, she appeared to be handling the pressure well, perhaps even proving that civilian contractors could maintain standards under scrutiny. But Grace wasn't just enduring harassment. She was observing. Her trained mind cataloged every face, every voice, every action taken against her. She noted which pilots were followers and which were leaders, who participated enthusiastically and who seemed uncomfortable with the group dynamics. Most importantly, she observed their attitudes toward authority, their respect for procedures, and their willingness to cut corners when they thought no one important was watching. In her previous life, such observations had been crucial for evaluating pilot reliability under stress. Personal character often became the determining factor when split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Grace was seeing character revealed in its rawest form, and she was filing away every detail for future reference. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the VIP officials concluded their inspection with glowing reviews of Falcon Point's capabilities, Grace continued her quiet work in the distant parking area. The pilots celebrated their successful demonstration, confident that they had impressed their visitors while also establishing proper boundaries with civilian support staff. None of them noticed that Grace had positioned herself with clear sightlines to the Flight Operations Center, or that she was monitoring radio chatter from maintenance crews preparing aircraft for the next day's training missions. They didn't see her checking wind indicators and weather patterns with the automatic precision of someone who had once coordinated flight operations in some of the world's most dangerous airspace. They had successfully marginalized her, pushed her to the edges of their world, and convinced themselves that she posed no threat to their carefully ordered hierarchy. What they failed to understand was that the edges often provided the best vantage point for seeing everything that mattered. And Grace was seeing more than they realized.
At 15:47 hours, Lieutenant Derek Vaughn was climbing through 12,000 feet in his FA-18 Super Hornet, executing what should have been a routine training exercise. The afternoon demonstration flights had concluded successfully, the VIP officials had departed with positive reviews, and now the squadron was transitioning to advanced combat maneuvering practice. Vaughn felt invincible. He'd performed flawlessly during the inspection. His social media posts about the morning's parking attendant encounter were generating impressive engagement. And he was flying one of the most sophisticated fighter aircraft ever built. What Vaughn didn't know was that a microscopic crack in his port engine's turbine housing had been growing for the past 43 flight hours, invisible to routine inspections, but steadily weakening under the stress of repeated thermal cycles. The crack had reached critical length during his demonstration flight, and now, as he pushed the throttles forward for a high-G training maneuver, metallurgy and physics conspired to create the kind of emergency that separated competent pilots from dead ones. The first indication of trouble was subtle. A barely perceptible vibration transmitted through the aircraft structure into Vaughn's seat. His instruments showed normal readings, engine parameters within acceptable ranges, but something felt wrong. Vaughn had enough flight hours to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that his $1 million fighter jet was developing a serious problem. Tower Falcon 27, Vaughn transmitted, his voice steady despite the growing concern in his mind. Requesting permission to return to base, experiencing unusual vibrations, unknown cause. In the control tower, Air Traffic Controller Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb responded immediately. Falcon 27 tower cleared direct to base, maintain current altitude, state nature of emergency. Negative emergency at this time, Vaughn replied, his training taking over. Precautionary return only, running diagnostic checks now.
But even as he spoke those words, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The turbine crack had reached critical failure point, and the port engine began consuming itself from the inside. Metal fragments, heated to nearly 2,000 degrees, started shredding through critical components at supersonic speeds. Warning lights began illuminating across Vaughn's instrument panel like a deadly Christmas tree. Tower, Falcon 2-7, Vaughn's voice carried new urgency now. Port engine failure, multiple warning lights, declaring emergency, requesting immediate vectors for emergency landing. In the Base Operations Center, the atmosphere shifted instantly from routine afternoon training to crisis management mode. Emergency sirens began wailing, crash rescue vehicles rolled out of their stations, and the fire department activated full emergency protocols. But coordinating an emergency landing for a crippled fighter jet required more than just emergency services. It demanded precise communication, split-second timing, and expertise that could only come from years of experience managing aircraft in distress. Senior Chief Webb was competent, but he was primarily trained for routine traffic control. Emergency situations like this typically fell under the purview of specialized personnel who understood the complex systems aboard modern fighter aircraft. Unfortunately, Falcon Point's senior emergency coordinator was attending a training conference in Norfolk, leaving the base temporarily short-staffed in exactly the kind of expertise they now desperately needed. Falcon 2-7, maintain heading 270, descend to 8,000 feet. Webb transmitted, consulting his emergency procedures manual. Emergency vehicles are responding. Runway 24 is being cleared for emergency landing. But Vaughn's situation was deteriorating faster than standard procedures could accommodate. The port engine wasn't just failing, it was disintegrating, sending metal debris into critical flight control systems. His hydraulic pressure was dropping, his electrical systems were showing anomalies, and the aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Tower, I'm losing hydraulics, Vaughn reported, his voice tight with concentration. Aircraft handling is degraded, may not be able to maintain controlled flight much longer. From her position in the distant parking area, Grace heard the emergency sirens and automatically looked up at the aircraft overhead. Her trained eyes immediately identified the FA-18 in distress. She could see the unusual flight profile, the slightly erratic movements that indicated control problems, and most tellingly, the faint trail of debris streaming from the port engine nacelle. Grace's pulse quickened as recognition flooded through her. She'd seen this exact scenario before during her years coordinating carrier air operations. Engine failures in single-seat fighters were among the most dangerous emergencies in aviation, requiring immediate and precise coordination between pilot and ground control to prevent catastrophic loss of life.
Without conscious thought, Grace reached for her radio, her thumb moving toward the transmission button. Then she stopped, remembering her current status. She was a civilian contractor working parking enforcement, specifically ordered to avoid any contact with flight operations. Commander Hendricks had made it clear that her observations and expertise were neither wanted nor welcome in military aviation matters. But as she watched Vaughn's aircraft struggling to maintain controlled flight, Grace's professional instincts screamed warnings that the current emergency response was inadequate. She could hear the radio transmissions from her handheld unit, and the coordination between tower and pilot was following textbook procedures designed for routine emergencies, not catastrophic multiple systems failures. In the control tower, Webb was consulting his emergency manual, trying to balance standard procedures with the rapidly evolving crisis. But the manual was written for single-point failures, not the cascading systems breakdown that Vaughn was experiencing. What the situation required was someone who understood the complex interactions between engine failures, hydraulic systems, electrical backups, and flight control degradation. Someone who had talked dozens of pilots through similar emergencies and knew which procedures worked in real-world conditions versus theoretical scenarios. Falcon 2-7, continue descent to 6,000 feet, Webb transmitted. How is your aircraft handling? Getting worse, Vaughn replied, his voice strained with the effort of controlling an increasingly unresponsive aircraft. I may need to consider ejection if I can't maintain control.
Grace's hands clenched involuntarily. Ejection over populated areas was extremely dangerous, not just for the pilot, but for civilians on the ground. The aircraft would become an unguided missile weighing 16 tons, carrying enough fuel to level city blocks if it crashed in the wrong location. But more critically, Grace could see that Vaughn still had options. If someone could guide him through the right procedures, coordinate the proper approach profile, and help him manage his remaining systems effectively. The question was whether anyone in the current emergency response team had the experience and knowledge to save both the pilot and everyone on the ground below. As Grace watched the drama unfolding overhead, she realized that she might be the only person at Falcon Point who had successfully coordinated exactly this type of emergency before. The same expertise that had been dismissed as irrelevant civilian contractor knowledge was now the difference between life and death for a young pilot who had spent the morning mocking her qualifications. Irony, Grace reflected grimly, had a way of making itself known at the worst possible moments.
At 15:51 hours, Lieutenant Derek Vaughn's F/18 Super Hornet was 4 minutes away from becoming an uncontrolled missile screaming toward the Earth at 400 miles per hour. His port engine had completely disintegrated, taking with it primary hydraulic systems, backup electrical power, and most of his flight control authority. The aircraft was responding to control inputs like a drunk elephant, sluggish, unpredictable, and increasingly dangerous with each passing second. In the control tower, Senior Chief Webb was sweating through his uniform as he consulted emergency procedures that seemed woefully inadequate for the crisis unfolding before him. Standard protocols called for vectoring the aircraft to a long, straight approach that would minimize control demands on the damaged systems. But Vaughn's Super Hornet was losing altitude faster than anticipated, and the prescribed approach path would take him directly over Jacksonville's most densely populated suburbs. Falcon 27, maintain heading 270, continue descent to 4,000 feet, Webb transmitted, his voice betraying the strain of coordinating an emergency beyond his experience level. Tower, I can't maintain this heading much longer, Vaughn replied, his voice tight with the physical effort of controlling an aircraft that no longer wanted to fly. Aircraft is pulling left, I'm fighting it with everything I've got. May need to punch out in the next 60 seconds. From her position in the distant parking area, Grace could see the mathematical certainty of disaster unfolding. Vaughn's aircraft was on a trajectory that would take him over 3 elementary schools, 2 shopping centers, and a residential area housing nearly 15,000 people. If he ejected, the unmanned fighter would continue its death spiral into one of the most populated areas of Jacksonville. But Grace also saw something that the tower controllers couldn't see from their position, a potential solution hidden in the geometry of Falcon Point's runway configuration and the prevailing wind patterns. There was a way to save both the pilot and the civilians below, but it required abandoning standard procedures and implementing an emergency approach that most air traffic controllers had never seen attempted in real-world conditions. Grace looked at her radio, then at the aircraft overhead, and then made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She switched her handheld unit to the emergency frequency and keyed the microphone. Tower, this is Falcon Point Ground Services. She transmitted using her civilian contractor call sign, but speaking with the crisp authority of someone who had coordinated air operations in combat zones. There was a moment of stunned silence on the radio frequency. Senior Chief Webb's voice came back sharp with confusion and anger. Ground Services, you are not authorized for air traffic control communications. Clear this frequency immediately. Negative, Tower. I have specific experience with this type of emergency and can provide guidance that will save lives. Falcon 27 is currently tracking toward populated areas with 15,000 civilians at risk. In his crippled aircraft, Vaughn heard the exchange with growing bewilderment. The voice offering help was female, calm, and carried an authority that suggested extensive experience with aviation emergencies. But according to the tower, it was coming from ground services, civilian contractors who had no business interfering with emergency flight operations. Who the hell is this? Vaughn transmitted, his question directed to the tower but audible to everyone monitoring the emergency frequency. Grace didn't wait for permission that would never come. Falcon 27. This is Chief Warrant Officer Grace Novak, former Naval Air Operations.
I have successfully coordinated 47 emergency landings, including 12 single-engine failures in Super Hornets. I can talk you through this if you're willing to listen. The radio frequency fell silent except for the background static of multiple monitoring stations. In the control tower, Webb was frantically consulting his procedures manual, trying to find guidance for a situation no manual had ever anticipated: a civilian contractor claiming military expertise during an active aviation emergency. "Tower, what's your guidance?" Vaughn asked, his voice strained as he fought to keep his aircraft under control. "I need answers now, not in 5 minutes." Webb looked around the tower cab, seeking support from colleagues who were equally stunned by the unprecedented situation. Standard procedure demanded that he maintain control of the emergency response, but the aircraft was deteriorating faster than his manual could accommodate, and the woman on the radio was offering expertise that might be their only hope. "Falcon 27, Grace transmitted before Webb could respond. "I need you to execute an immediate right turn to heading 090. This will take you away from populated areas and position you for a modified approach to runway 06.
Negative, Webb transmitted immediately. Falcon 27, maintain current heading. Ground services, you are ordered to cease all transmissions on this frequency. But Vaughn had heard something in Grace's voice that Webb's manual couldn't provide: the confidence of someone who had successfully guided pilots through similar crises. With his aircraft becoming increasingly uncontrollable and populated areas rushing toward him at 4 miles per minute, standard procedures were beginning to look like a guaranteed path to catastrophe. "Chief Novak?" Vaughn transmitted, using Grace's claimed rank despite the confusion surrounding her identity. "What's your recommended course of action?" Grace felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the same burden she'd carried during years of coordinating carrier air operations, where single mistakes meant death. But this time the weight felt different. This wasn't about proving herself or advancing her career. It was about preventing a tragedy that she alone had the expertise to avoid. "Falcon 27, turn right heading 090 immediately," she directed, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once guided hundreds of pilots through dangerous landings. "Reduce power to minimum, prepare for single-engine approach to runway 06. I'll talk you through each step." "Tower, what are your instructions?" Vaughn asked, seeking official authorization for what every instinct told him was the right decision. Webb stared at his emergency manual, then at the radar screen showing Vaughn's aircraft tracking toward populated areas, then at the growing crowd of senior officers who had rushed to the tower when they heard about the unauthorized transmissions from a civilian contractor. Among them was Commander Hendricks, who had arrived just in time to hear Grace's claimed credentials and her confident directions to the pilot in distress. His face was flushed with anger at the breach of protocol. But beneath the anger was a growing realization that the woman he'd dismissed as an incompetent civilian contractor might be the only person at Falcon Point with the expertise to prevent a tragedy. "Falcon 27, Webb finally transmitted, his voice reflecting the enormous weight of the decision. "You're cleared to follow guidance from Chief Novak. Execute right turn to heading 090 immediately." As Vaughn's aircraft began its turn away from populated areas, Grace felt the familiar rhythm of emergency coordination taking over. She was no longer a civilian contractor working parking enforcement. She was Chief Warrant Officer Grace Novak, and she had work to do. "Falcon 27, how is your aircraft responding to the turn?" Grace transmitted, her voice carrying the calm precision that had once guided pilots through carrier landings in 30-foot seas. From her position in the parking area, she could see Vaughn's Super Hornet banking slowly to the right, trailing a thin stream of hydraulic fluid that caught the afternoon sunlight like a deadly rainbow. "Turn is sluggish but responding," Vaughn replied, his voice tight with concentration. "I'm losing more hydraulic pressure, and the stick feels like it's fighting me on every input." Grace's mind processed the information instantly, cross-referencing it with dozens of similar emergencies she'd coordinated during her Navy career. Hydraulic failure in F-18s followed predictable patterns, and she knew exactly which systems would fail next and in what sequence.
Copy that, Falcon 27. That's normal progression for this type of failure. Grace responded, her tone confident enough to reassure the pilot without minimizing the danger. You're going to lose more authority as we continue, but I can work with what you have left. What's your current altitude and airspeed? Passing through 3,200 feet, airspeed 240 knots, Vaughn reported. In the control tower, Commander Hendricks stood behind Senior Chief Webb, listening to the emergency coordination with growing amazement. The woman they'd dismissed as an incompetent civilian contractor was demonstrating a level of aviation expertise that surpassed most of his experienced air traffic controllers. Her questions were precise, her instructions were clear, and, most importantly, her confidence was infectious. Even over the radio, Vaughn sounded calmer and more focused than he had since the emergency began. Falcon 27, I need you to reduce power and begin a gentle descent. Target 200 knots airspeed, 500 feet per minute descent rate. The key is keeping everything smooth and predictable. No sudden movements, no rapid power changes. Roger, reducing power now, Vaughn acknowledged. The change in engine noise was audible over the radio as he pulled back the throttle on his remaining engine. Grace monitored his progress, visualizing the approach path in her mind. Runway 06 at Falcon Point was longer than most carrier decks, but much less forgiving. There were no arresting cables to stop a fast-moving fighter jet and no margin for error if the approach went wrong. But she'd calculated the geometry carefully, and she knew that with proper coordination, even a severely damaged Super Hornet could be landed safely. Tower, I need crash rescue positioned at the approach end of runway 06, Grace transmitted, her instructions directed to the air traffic controllers, but spoken with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding emergency operations. Also need fire suppression equipment standing by. We're going to have hydraulic fluid and possibly fuel spillage on touchdown. Senior Chief Webb looked to Commander Hendricks for guidance. The woman was issuing orders like she owned the base, but her instructions were exactly what emergency protocols called for in this situation. Do it, Hendricks said quietly. Get crash rescue repositioned. As emergency vehicles raced across the base toward their new positions, Grace continued talking Vaughn through the modified approach procedures. Falcon 27, you're going to feel the aircraft want to drop the left wing as you slow down. Don't fight it aggressively. Use gentle pressure, small corrections. The damaged systems respond better to subtle inputs. Copy that. I can feel what you're talking about. It's like the aircraft has a mind of its own. That's exactly right. You're not flying the aircraft anymore. You're negotiating with it. Every input is a request, not a command. Work with what it wants to do. Guide it toward what you need it to do. The advice was pure poetry to experienced pilots, the kind of wisdom that could only come from someone who had successfully managed aircraft in extremis. In the tower, several controllers exchanged glances of recognition. They were listening to a masterclass in emergency aviation coordination. Falcon 27, turn left heading 060. Continue descent to 1,500 feet. You're looking good on approach path, maintaining good control authority. Turning left to 060, descending to 1,500. Vaughn acknowledged. For the first time since the emergency began, his voice carried a note of cautious optimism. As Vaughn's aircraft aligned with the runway, Grace could see the final phase of the emergency unfolding. The Super Hornet was flying slower and lower than normal, its damaged systems requiring constant attention from the pilot, but it was under control and tracking toward a safe landing. Falcon 27, you're cleared to land runway 06. Maintain current approach speed. Don't try to flare too aggressively on touchdown. Let the aircraft settle onto the runway and use your remaining brakes and steering to maintain directional control.
Cleared to land, runway 06, Vaughn confirmed. Chief Novak, thank you. I don't know who you are, but you just saved my life. Grace watched as the damaged fighter jet touched down on Falcon Point's main runway, sending up sparks from its damaged landing gear, but maintaining directional control throughout the landing roll. Crash rescue vehicles raced alongside the aircraft as it slowed, ready to respond to any post-landing emergencies, but Vaughn brought his Super Hornet to a controlled stop halfway down the runway. Falcon 27 is down safe, Vaughn transmitted, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and exhaustion.
Aircraft secure, pilot uninjured, requesting crash rescue inspection before shutdown. In the control tower, spontaneous applause broke out among the controllers and observers who had witnessed the successful emergency landing. Commander Hendricks stared at the runway where Vaughn's aircraft sat, surrounded by emergency vehicles, then turned his attention to the radio frequency where a civilian contractor had just demonstrated aviation expertise that had saved both $1 million aircraft and potentially hundreds of civilian lives. "Senior Chief," Hendricks said to Webb, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and growing respect, "I want to know everything about this Grace Novak, who she is, where she came from, and how a parking attendant knows more about emergency aviation procedures than our entire air traffic control staff." Webb nodded, already reaching for his phone. But even as he began making calls to identify the mysterious civilian contractor who had just coordinated a textbook emergency landing, he suspected that the answers would be far more complicated than anyone at Falcon Point was prepared to handle. On the runway, Vaughn was climbing out of his cockpit with the assistance of crash rescue personnel, safe and uninjured, thanks to the expertise of a woman his squadron had spent the entire day mocking and humiliating. The irony was not lost on anyone who had witnessed the afternoon's events. 20 minutes after Vaughn's successful emergency landing, the base operations center had transformed into a hub of frantic activity. Phone calls were being made to Washington, incident reports were being filed, and most urgently, a comprehensive investigation was underway to determine exactly who Grace Novak was and how a civilian parking attendant had demonstrated aviation expertise that surpassed most of their senior controllers. Commander Paul Hendricks stood in his office, staring at a computer screen that displayed Grace's personnel file, or rather, the deliberately sparse civilian contractor record that revealed almost nothing about her background. According to the official documentation, she was a 32-year-old woman with a clean driving record, basic security clearance, and no previous military experience. The file was so unremarkable, it was almost suspicious. "This doesn't make sense," Hendricks muttered to Master Chief Hutchins, who was reviewing the same information with growing confusion. Civilian contractors don't coordinate emergency landings. They don't use military terminology, and they sure as hell don't demonstrate the kind of expertise we just witnessed. Hutchins was already on his second phone call to Navy Personnel Command, trying to access classified databases that might reveal Grace's true background. "Sir, I think we need to consider the possibility that our parking attendant isn't who she claims to be." Before Hendricks could respond, his office door burst open without ceremony. Lieutenant Derek Vaughn strode in, his flight suit still reeking of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel, his face flushed with a mixture of adrenaline and confusion that came from surviving a near-death experience. "Commander, I need to know who that woman is," Vaughn announced without preamble. "The one who talked me through the landing. She saved my life, and she knew things about Super Hornet emergency procedures that aren't in any manual I've ever read." Hendricks gestured to a chair, but Vaughn remained standing, too agitated to sit still. "Lieutenant, we're trying to figure that out ourselves. What exactly did she tell you that seemed beyond normal civilian knowledge?" "Everything," Vaughn replied emphatically. "She knew the hydraulic failure progression patterns, she predicted exactly how the aircraft would handle as systems degraded, and she coordinated that approach like someone who'd done it dozens of times before. Commander, that wasn't beginner's luck, that was expertise." Master Chief Hutchins hung up his phone and turned to face the group. "Sir, I just spoke with a contact at Personnel Command. There is no current record of any Grace Novak in the Navy database. But," he paused, consulting his handwritten notes, "there was a Chief Warrant Officer Grace Novak who served from 2011 to 2020, specialized in carrier air operations, emergency coordination, and pilot rescue operations." The room fell silent. Hendricks leaned forward in his chair, processing the implications. What happened to her? Why did she leave the service? Hutchins' expression grew somber. "That's classified above my access level, sir. But the person I spoke with mentioned that her separation was connected to a congressional investigation and that her service record was exceptional until her final deployment." Before anyone could respond, Senior Chief Webb appeared in the doorway, his face pale with the kind of expression that came from discovering something that changed everything you thought you knew. "Commander," Webb said quietly, "you need to see this. I pulled the radio recordings from the emergency response and I ran voice analysis against our archived communications from carrier air operations. Sir, we have a positive match." He handed Hendricks a printed report that contained technical details about voice pattern analysis, but the conclusion was simple and undeniable. The woman who had coordinated Vaughn's emergency landing was the same person whose voice appeared in dozens of archived recordings from carrier air operations between 2015 and 2019. According to these records, Webb continued, Chief Warrant Officer Grace Novak was the primary air operations coordinator for Carrier Air Wing 5 during 3 combat deployments. She coordinated over 200 emergency situations, including 47 successful emergency landings under combat conditions. Vaughn sank into the chair he'd previously refused, the weight of realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Combat conditions," he repeated slowly. "We're talking about someone who coordinated emergencies while people were shooting at her?" Webb nodded grimly. "Sir, there's more. I found news articles from 2019 about a congressional hearing regarding a failed rescue mission in the Persian Gulf. Chief Warrant Officer Grace Novak was the air operations coordinator who attempted to guide a rescue mission that didn't end well." Hendricks was already reaching for his phone, placing a call to his superior officer. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple personnel mix-up. They had a former Navy chief warrant officer working as a civilian contractor under what appeared to be an assumed identity, and she had just demonstrated the kind of expertise that suggested she might be one of the most qualified aviation coordinators on the East Coast.
"And Commander," Webb added quietly, "there's something else you should know. I checked the timing of her employment here against her military separation date. She started working as a parking attendant exactly 4 years and 2 months after she left the Navy. That matches the timeline for when someone might be struggling with post-traumatic stress and looking for a way to stay connected to aviation without the responsibility of life or death decisions." The implications hung heavy in the office air. They had spent the entire day mocking and humiliating a decorated veteran who had served her country with distinction in some of the world's most dangerous combat zones. A woman who had saved countless lives during her military career and had just saved another life despite being treated with contempt and disrespect by the very people she had helped. Vaughn looked up from his hands, his face pale with the realization of what he and his squadron had done. "Commander, my pilots spent the morning making videos mocking her. We posted them on social media. We treated her like she was some kind of joke." "Lieutenant," Hendricks said quietly, "I think we're about to discover that the joke was on us." Outside, Grace was still in the parking area, methodically completing her civilian contractor duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She had returned to directing traffic and managing parking assignments with the same quiet professionalism she had maintained all day, giving no indication that she had just coordinated one of the most successful emergency landings in Falcon Point's recent history. But her calm exterior concealed the emotional turbulence of someone who had been forced to confront the skills and memories she had spent 4 years trying to leave behind. The familiar weight of responsibility, the split-second decisions that meant life or death, the voice in her headset crying for help, it all came flooding back with the clarity and intensity of a combat flashback. Grace had saved Derek Vaughn's life, but in doing so, she had also awakened the part of herself that she had been trying to forget. The question now was whether Falcon Point Naval Air Station was ready to confront the full truth about the woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a parking attendant. The answer to that question was about to arrive in the form of a Navy helicopter carrying the one person who could verify every detail of Grace's extraordinary military career. At 16:35 hours, the distinctive sound of rotors approaching from the northeast caused everyone at Falcon Point Naval Air Station to look skyward. The aircraft was a Navy MH-60 Seahawk,
its blue and white paint scheme identifying it as a VIP transport, flying with the kind of urgency that suggested an unscheduled arrival of significant importance. The helicopter circled the base once before settling onto the primary landing pad with military precision. From the aircraft's cabin stepped Admiral Janet Iron Lady Blackwood, her 4 stars gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, her expression carrying the kind of authority that could silence entire rooms with a single glance. At 58, Admiral Blackwood commanded the Navy's East Coast aviation operations from her headquarters in Norfolk, overseeing training programs, personnel assignments, and operational readiness for thousands of pilots and support staff. She was not someone who made unscheduled visits to subordinate bases without compelling reasons. Behind her followed Captain Robert Sterling, her aide-de-camp, and Senior Chief Petty Officer Amanda Cross, a personnel specialist whose presence suggested that official records and classified information would be central to whatever business had brought the Admiral to Falcon Point. Commander Hendricks, alerted to the Admiral's arrival by the control tower, rushed across the tarmac to meet her, his mind racing with questions about why such a high-ranking officer would appear without warning just hours after the emergency landing incident. "Admiral Blackwood," Hendricks said, snapping to attention and rendering a crisp salute. "Welcome to Falcon Point, ma'am. We weren't expecting—" "Commander," Admiral Blackwood interrupted, returning his salute with practiced efficiency. "I'm here because approximately 90 minutes ago, my office received a series of phone calls that have raised serious questions about personnel management and operational security at this facility." Her tone was neutral, but Hendricks had enough experience with flag officers to recognize the steel beneath the surface. Whatever had prompted this visit, it involved issues that could make or break careers. "Ma'am, if this is about the emergency landing," Hendricks began, "it's about Chief Warrant Officer Grace Novak. More specifically, it's about the fact that one of the Navy's most decorated aviation coordinators has been working as a civilian parking attendant at your base for 8 months, while your personnel treated her with contempt and disrespect." The words hit Hendricks like a physical blow. He'd suspected that Grace's background was more complex than her civilian contractor file indicated, but hearing it confirmed by a 4-star admiral made the situation infinitely more serious. "Admiral, we had no indication that she was former military personnel," Hendricks replied carefully. "Her civilian contractor documentation showed no previous service record." "That's because Chief Warrant Officer Novak requested anonymity after her separation from active duty," Captain Sterling interjected, consulting a thick folder of classified documents. "She wanted to work around aviation without the pressure of command responsibilities. Her psychological evaluation after the Persian Gulf incident recommended limited duty in non-critical positions." The Admiral's expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of the personal concern that had motivated her urgent trip to Falcon Point. "Commander, Grace Novak served under my command during her final deployment. She was the finest aviation coordinator I've ever worked with, and her separation from the Navy was one of the greatest losses our service has experienced in recent years." The Admiral gestured toward the Base Operations Center, where the afternoon's emergency response had been coordinated. "Today, she demonstrated exactly why her expertise was so valued. She saved the life of one of your pilots using skills that take decades to develop and experience that can't be taught in any classroom." Hendricks felt the weight of command responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "Ma'am, we didn't know. If we had understood her background, you would have treated her with the respect due to any veteran," Admiral Blackwood finished. "Instead, according to the reports I've received, your personnel spent the day mocking her, filming her for social media entertainment, and systematically excluding her from any meaningful participation in base operations." Senior Chief Cross stepped forward, her own folder containing detailed incident reports that had been compiled from radio recordings, witness statements, and social media posts. Admiral, we have documented evidence of harassment directed toward Chief Novak by multiple personnel, including commissioned officers who should have known better. The Admiral's attention shifted toward the flight line, where she could see Grace in the distance, still performing her civilian contractor duties with the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her military service. Where is she now? Parking area 7, ma'am. She returned to her assigned duties immediately after coordinating the emergency landing.
Admiral Blackwood's expression hardened. She coordinated a successful emergency landing that saved both pilot and aircraft, then went back to directing parking? Commander, do you understand what that tells me about her psychological state and her commitment to service despite the treatment she's received? Before Hendricks could respond, Lieutenant Derek Vaughn approached the group, his flight suit still showing evidence of his harrowing experience. He had heard about the Admiral's arrival and felt compelled to present himself, both to report on the emergency and to face the consequences of his squadron's behavior. "Admiral Blackwood," Vaughn said, saluting with a precision born of nervous energy. "Lieutenant Derek Vaughn, ma'am. I was the pilot involved in today's emergency landing." The Admiral studied him with the kind of penetrating gaze that could see through military facades to the character beneath. "Lieutenant, tell me about Chief Novak's coordination of your emergency response." Vaughn's voice carried the sincerity of someone whose life had been saved by exceptional skill. "Ma'am, she was extraordinary. She knew things about Super Hornet emergency procedures that aren't in any manual. She predicted exactly how my aircraft would behave as systems failed, and she guided me through an approach that I couldn't have executed without her expertise." "And before the emergency," Admiral Blackwood continued, "how did you and your squadron interact with Chief Novak?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Vaughn's face flushed with shame as he realized that his morning's entertainment had involved mocking a decorated veteran whose skills had just saved his life. "Ma'am, we didn't know who she was," Vaughn said quietly. "We treated her as a civilian contractor who didn't understand military protocols. We were unprofessional in our interactions." Admiral Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but her silence spoke volumes. She turned to Captain Sterling, who was already preparing documentation for what would clearly become a formal investigation. "Captain, I want a complete review of this incident, including all social media posts, witness statements, and command decisions that led to Chief Novak being placed in a position where her expertise was ignored and her service record was unknown to base personnel." She looked back at Commander Hendricks, her voice carrying the weight of years spent building and protecting naval aviation excellence. "Commander, I'm going to speak with Chief Novak personally. Then we're going to discuss how Falcon Point Naval Aviation Station plans to address the systemic failures that allowed the situation to develop." As Admiral Blackwood walked toward the distant parking area where Grace continued her quiet work, every person who had witnessed the day's events understood that the consequences were just beginning. The woman they had dismissed as an incompetent civilian contractor was about to be validated by the highest levels of Naval Aviation Command. And everyone who had participated in her humiliation was about to learn that some mistakes carried consequences that extended far beyond temporary embarrassment.
Admiral Janet Blackwood walked across the tarmac toward Parking Area 7 with the measured stride of someone who had spent decades navigating the complex terrain of military leadership. Behind her, at a respectful distance, followed Commander Hendricks, Captain Sterling, and Lieutenant Vaughn, all understanding that they were about to witness a conversation that would define careers and possibly reshape how Falcon Point Naval Air Station approached veteran affairs. Grace saw the Admiral approaching long before the small entourage came within speaking distance. Her trained eyes recognized the 4-star insignia, the purposeful stride, and, most tellingly, the expression of someone carrying both authority and personal concern. Grace had served under enough flag officers to understand that this was not a routine visit or a casual inspection. This was about her.
As Admiral Blackwood drew closer, Grace set down her clipboard and stood at attention, her civilian contractor uniform somehow managing to convey the same dignity and respect that her military dress blues had once projected. Despite 4 years away from active duty, her posture remained unmistakably military, shoulders square, chin level, eyes focused straight ahead. "Chief Warrant Officer Grace Novak," Admiral Blackwood said as she stopped 3 feet away, her voice carrying across the parking area with crisp authority. "Admiral Blackwood," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the emotional turbulence of being addressed by her former rank after months of civilian anonymity. "Ma'am." The Admiral studied Grace's face, seeing past the civilian clothes and civilian job to the exceptional officer who had once coordinated air operations under the most demanding conditions imaginable. "At ease, Chief. We need to talk." Grace shifted to parade rest, her hands clasped behind her back, her expression revealing nothing of the internal conflict between her desire for continued anonymity and her ingrained respect for military authority. "I understand you coordinated an emergency landing this afternoon, saved the life of Lieutenant Vaughn, and prevented what could have been a catastrophic crash in a populated area." "Yes, ma'am. I provided assistance during an aviation emergency." Admiral Blackwood smiled slightly at Grace's deliberate understatement. "Chief, I've reviewed the radio recordings and spoken with the air traffic controllers. What you provided was a masterclass in emergency aviation coordination that most of my senior controllers couldn't have executed under pressure." Grace remained silent, but Admiral Blackwood could see the subtle tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested emotional walls carefully constructed and fiercely maintained. "I also understand," the Admiral continued, "that prior to this emergency, you were subjected to harassment, mockery, and systematic exclusion by personnel who didn't understand your background or respect your service." For the first time, Grace's composure showed a hairline crack. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and her gaze shifted momentarily toward Lieutenant Vaughn, who stood 20 feet away, his face flushed with shame. "Ma'am, I'm a civilian contractor now," Grace said quietly. "I understood the position when I accepted it." "Bullshit, Chief," Admiral Blackwood replied, her language carrying the blunt honesty that came with 4 decades of military service. "You took a parking job because you wanted to stay close to aviation without the responsibility of life or death decisions. You were healing, and you deserve the space to do that without being treated like a second-class citizen by people who couldn't carry your gear." Grace's carefully maintained emotional control wavered slightly. After months of absorbing condescension and mockery without response, being acknowledged and defended by someone who understood her service felt almost overwhelming. "Admiral, I left the Navy for good reasons," Grace said, her voice carrying a note of pain that years hadn't fully healed. "The Persian Gulf operation. People died because of decisions I made. I couldn't carry that responsibility anymore." Admiral Blackwood stepped closer, her voice softening with genuine compassion. "Grace, I read the classified after-action reports. You coordinated a rescue operation in impossible conditions against overwhelming odds. You saved 12 pilots that day. The 3 we lost weren't your fault. They were casualties of war and mechanical failure." "The congressional investigation concluded," Grace began. "The congressional investigation was political theater. Politicians needed someone to blame for a mission that went wrong despite perfect planning and execution. You were the convenient target because you were junior enough to sacrifice and competent enough to make the criticism seem credible." Grace looked down at her civilian shoes, the same canvas sneakers that had been mocked just hours earlier by pilots who owed their lives to expertise she had demonstrated under combat conditions. "Ma'am, I appreciate your support, but I've made peace with my decision to leave the service."
Admiral Blackwood nodded slowly. "I'm not here to pressure you back into uniform, Chief. I'm here to offer you something different." She gestured toward Captain Sterling, who stepped forward with an official document folder. "The Navy is establishing a new civilian position, Senior Aviation Safety Coordinator for Training Facilities. It would allow you to use your expertise in a consulting capacity without the command responsibilities that caused you difficulty.
You'd work with bases like Falcon Point to improve emergency response procedures and train personnel in crisis management. Grace looked at the folder, then back at Admiral Blackwood. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm ready." "You're ready," Lieutenant Vaughn's voice interrupted from behind them. He approached with hesitant steps, his expression carrying the weight of someone who had learned a profound lesson about respect and assumptions. "Chief Novak, you saved my life today. You did it despite the way my squadron treated you, despite having every reason to let someone else handle the emergency." Vaughn stopped directly in front of Grace, his posture showing genuine respect for the first time since their initial encounter. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology that I'll probably spend the rest of my career trying to make meaningful. But more than that, the Navy needs people like you in positions where your expertise can prevent tragedies and save lives." Grace studied the young pilot's face, seeing past his earlier arrogance to the decent person underneath who had simply made the mistake of judging competence by appearance and rank by uniform. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "you followed instructions under pressure and executed a difficult landing under degraded conditions. You did your job well today." "Only because you told me how to do it," Vaughn replied honestly. Admiral Blackwood watched the exchange with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed genuine character growth under pressure. "Chief, the position comes with full civilian contractor benefits, housing allowance, and, most importantly, the authority to implement changes that will prevent other veterans from being treated the way you were treated here." Grace looked around the parking area where she had spent 8 months in anonymous service, then at the flight line where her expertise had just prevented a catastrophe, then finally back at Admiral Blackwood, who represented both her past achievements and her potential future contributions. "Admiral," Grace said slowly, "I'd like to review the position requirements and consider the opportunity." "Outstanding," Admiral Blackwood replied with genuine warmth. "Captain Sterling will provide you with all the details. But Chief, I want you to understand something. The Navy never stopped valuing your service, and aviation safety is too important to waste expertise like yours on parking enforcement." As the Admiral prepared to leave, she turned back one final time. "Oh, and Chief, I want you to know that the social media posts and harassment incidents are being investigated at the highest levels. There will be consequences for the personnel involved and policy changes to ensure this kind of treatment of veterans never happens again." 3 weeks later, Grace Novak walked back onto Falcon Point Naval Air Station, this time wearing a professional blazer with credentials identifying her as Senior Aviation Safety Coordinator. Her first assignment was conducting a comprehensive review of emergency response procedures and training protocols. Lieutenant Derek Vaughn, now serving as her primary liaison with the pilot community, met her at the main gate with a crisp salute and genuine respect. Behind him stood the other pilots who had participated in her earlier humiliation, all of whom had volunteered to participate in the new safety training program she would be implementing. As Grace walked across the same tarmac where she had once been dismissed and mocked, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found a way to serve without compromising her emotional well-being. She was no longer hiding from her expertise or her past. She was channeling both into a future where other veterans would be recognized for their value rather than dismissed for their appearance. The parking attendant had become the teacher, the student had become the master, and respect had been earned in the most powerful way possible, through competence demonstrated under pressure when it mattered most. Sometimes the strongest voices were indeed the ones that never had to shout. And sometimes you didn't need a uniform to command respect. You just needed the courage to use your expertise when lives hung in the balance. Grace Novak had found her way home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.